Hey everyone, welcome to Artist Decoded. This is your host Yoshino, and thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Today I get the opportunity to introduce you all to my friend, film director Jacqueline Castel. She came onto the program to talk about her debut feature film entitled My Animal, which initially premiered at this year's Sundance Film Festival. It's now making its nationwide release at the Alamo Drafthouse in New York City today, Friday, September 8th. So if you're in New York, I highly recommend that you go right now and purchase tickets because I personally love this film, and I think you can tell by the way that I interviewed Jacqueline that I had a lot of various thoughts about it, and it's such a new take on the genre. But let me tell you a bit about the film by reading the synopsis, and then I'm going to be reading the director's statement. Bobby Salvor Menouez from Euphoria and Amandla Stenberg from Bodies, Bodies, Bodies ignite in this genre-bending supernatural love story. Tormented by a hidden family curse, Heather, played by Bobby, is forced to live a secluded life on the outskirts of a small town. When she falls for the rebellious Johnny, played by Amandla, their connection threatens to unravel Heather's suppressed desires, tempting her to unleash the animal within. Okay, so that was the synopsis. Now let me read you the director's statement from Jacqueline. My Animal is a story about inheritance and what gets passed through our lineage and how that defines us as individuals. It's also a story about first love and how that can serve as a catalyst for radical change, revealing what we most need and what most needs healing within us. Like Heather, I understand the quiet despair and isolation of being an outsider in a small town, and of rebelling against it in youth, only to discover that the most treasured and distinctive aspects of my selfhood derive from the very things I attempted to reject. In fact, it's what made me different and also defined and ultimately transformed me. In J. Matthews' screenwriting, also for those out there to give a bit of context, but J. Matthews is one part of the duo Boy Harsher, who is an incredible band, and I feel like everyone would really like them that listens to this program. But let me read that again. In J. Matthews' screenwriting, I found the pain and joy of our mirrored adolescent struggles, our complex family relationships, and the difficulty of navigating our earliest and most formative relationships. The real battle we each waged in youth, and the one Heather's character must also face, is finding the courage of self-acceptance and self-expression. Through the struggles of these characters, we encounter what works and what does not in the quest for identity, authenticity, and self-actualization, and the courage we must summon in the face of personal crisis and discrimination. This classical outsider framework translates beautifully to the mythology of the werewolf. In My Animal, I invite the viewer to get lost in the otherness of Heather Anderson. In so doing, I not only compel the audience to feel connected to a character who at first may appear to have little in common with them, but also to learn the same lessons that she does, only by embracing the traits that make us outcasts and even subject to scorn do we learn to become fully ourselves. I love this film. You definitely have to go watch it. I mean, you don't even have to like werewolf movies. I feel like it's so much further beyond that in terms of depth and the way that it shifts the genre, if you will. But anyways, before the podcast begins, please go to our iTunes page. You know the drill. Or you can go to our Spotify page and leave us a quick review there. It's just one click of the button to get that 5 stars. So it helps reviewers just like yourself to hear about this podcast. So I would greatly appreciate that. So here it is, my conversation with my friend, director, Jacqueline Castel. Hope you all enjoy it. All right. Well, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, really appreciate you for taking the time. And I wanted to start off with just like a very simple question, but like, what got you into directing films?
I think it started pretty early for me. I started getting into photography when I was quite young. I mean, I think I basically had my my father's like Canon A1 camera we were talking about the other night that I started taking photographs on when, I was maybe like 12 or 13. I built like a dark room in my parents' garage. And also at the same time, I was watching a lot of movies. I think movies were like a big escape for me. It was a way for me to deal with complex emotions that I was like feeling at the time. And they really helped me. And so I started getting really into movies. And then, as I was also getting into photography, it was kind of funny because in high school, we had friends of the family who lived in Utah in Park City where Sundance happens. And they were friends of my parents, and they were like, well, like, we know Jacqueline's really getting into films. Would she ever want to just like come up to the festival and hang out and see movies? And so that started this kind of yearly ritual where I would skip all my high school finals and go crash at their place in Park City. And they would send me the catalog when it would come, when it would be like printed. And I'd circle all the movies, and then they would get really big discounts because they were volunteers at the festival. So then I would go to Park City and just kind of like watch movies, like anything I could possibly see. I would sit in lines. I would sit there totally by myself. I would watch everything I could. I would go up to directors that I thought were really interesting. I remember seeing John Waters there when I was a kid and like going up to him when he was smoking a cigarette outside of the Coquettes documentary screening and just being like, I love you. And he was so supportive and cool. And it was really meaningful to me because I was kind of a loner in high school and when I was young. And so these were like really impactful experiences for me. So that just kind of got me into that. And when I was at Sundance, I ended up meeting a professor at CalArts there in California. And there was like a summer high school program for filmmakers. And so I was encouraged to apply. Which I wasn't sure if would work or not because I was in Nevada and I was like, oh, they only take a certain amount of California applicants, but they did take me, or non-California applicants, and they did take me. And then I did that program, and then there was no turning back. Like it was just like I fell in love because it was and I really loved that education because it was like they had, a Super 8 class, they had a digital class, they had a 16 millimeter found footage class where you were like hand splicing things and like actually working on the like celluloid and stuff. So I really fell in love because it was just like photography, but I got to do so much more with it. So, then I applied to film school for college, and then that brought me to New York, and then it just kept going. So it's been kind of lifelong for me. I kind of knew pretty early I wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm. And so let me retrace that a little bit. So you started going to Sundance around the time when you were like 14, 15, 16?
Yeah, it was probably like 15, 16 would have been like the first year. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was I feel very fortunate to have just lucked out into that situation because I don't think that would have happened any other way. It was just my parents' friends and business partners happened to live out there.
Mm-hmm. And then you said at the festival you met the CalArts professor. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And then when did you go to that CalArts summer program?
I think it was probably when I was like 17. It's probably something like that. It was like, I think between my junior and senior year. So I think I was like 17. Mm-hmm. And so then I went to that program, and I think that was like a month or 6 weeks or something like that during the summer. And yeah, that was like the most at home I think I had ever felt anywhere. it was just total mania. Like I felt like it was a little out of control, a little off the rails, but in like the best way possible. Like it was really interesting. And so when I went to NYU afterwards, it was kind of a little bit of a culture shock because I guess I was expecting it to have that kind of Cal Arts feel to it, but it was just not like that at all. And so I really like, I had a hard time adjusting at first to like quote proper like film school or whatever.
So what would you say are the differences, like the things that you experience over at Cal Arts as opposed to what you experience at NYU?
I just felt like I was being exposed to much more radical ideas and concepts at Cal Arts, and there was a lot more playfulness and creativity. It was all portfolio based, and I think that after I worked a few jobs when I was in college, and one of the jobs was to be like a TA for their summer program that's kind of similar, like for filmmakers, and it kind of lifted the curtain on some of their practices in terms of who they admit in and the VIP statuses and things like that. And you start to realize that, like, you know, Cal Arts, I guess, felt a lot because it was very strictly portfolio based, and not necessarily about like your grades or things like that, like, or other sort of political factors that might enter into the educational system. I felt that there was just I don't know, there was just maybe more of a purity to it. Like, maybe that sounds kind of naive. I don't know how much purity there is in schools anymore, but like, I felt like there was that for that one little moment, and it was really, really exciting to me. But I found that also, like, like NYU had like a study abroad program in the Czech Republic, which I did for 35 millimeter. And that was really incredible. That was really, really special. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just felt like I was, it felt almost too entry level or something at NYU. I know that sounds sort of strange, but like, I felt like all the films that we were watching were things that I had watched when I was like 13. And I was like, haven't you guys seen this? If you're like a real student of the cinema, you would have already have seen these movies. And maybe that's just me being a snob, but I was just obsessive.
Like which films?
I don't know. I mean, like, I'm trying to think of like stuff that they would show you, but like I feel like, yeah, I don't know. Or there's like very boilerplate kind of stuff that you get shown maybe in like film school that I was like, I felt like I was way ahead of that, or like I was like racing past that, or I was really hungry for, I don't know, different reference points. And so, yeah, that also led me to be at Kim's Video so much that they offered me a job. I was there every single day after school, just like sitting on the floor looking through all of their movies, until at one point they're just like, do you just want to work here? Because you're here like every day. And I think at that point I was watching at least 2 movies a night, every night. So I was like pretty like in it when I first moved to New York. So yeah, so then I started working there, and then I really feel like that was like my real film education once I got to New York was at Kim's, because the just like the staff there, the knowledge that they had, the kind of collection that was there, the kind of clients that would come in, you were just interfacing with incredibly interesting people, like and you know, musicians and artists and filmmakers and actors. Just like, it was a really interesting kind of creative hub for people to come together. Like, I really love the community aspect of Kim's, and that's the one thing that I think that I really miss from video store culture, is how much of it it's a community thing more than anything. That's why I also really like how theaters are starting to incorporate more social spaces, like, you know, bars or restaurants that are part of the theater itself, because I think that helps promote a cinema culture, and I think that's really important. So I really love supporting those types of spaces that allow people to congregate after a film and talk about the ideas.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so for people who don't have a reference for what Kim's Video is and how important they are to the lexicon of film as a whole, but also that they're such a relic for New York City, like, how would you describe that to people? Oh,
yeah. I mean, when I came to New York, I think it was like the first place I went. So I worked at and would frequent the East Village location on St. Mark's Street. But Kim's Video was like a video store that started in the 1980s in New York. And it started out as a dry cleaner. The owner, Mr. Kim, he like turned it into a video store, became extremely obsessive. And the collection ended up being, I think, like for the video rental was like, I don't know, somewhere around 55,000 to 60,000 titles in one location alone.
In VHS and DVD?
Yeah. And so that's what it developed into by the time I worked there in the 2000s. And so for me, it was just kind of this legendary place as being like someone that was really deeply into cinema. It was like, you have to go to Kim's. It was kind of like the idea. And I remember just thinking like, so, I mean, it was close to where I was going to school too, because it was in the East Village and that's where NYU is. So I was living down the street from it too at the time. And I don't know, like legendary underground New York City mini chain that had at St. Mark's location. It had locations when I first moved to New York in like the West Village. I think that's where Kim's Underground was. And then there were some various different locations that had different lengths of time, but the St. Mark's one was really like the epic one because it was 3 floors. Mr. Kim owned the whole building. And the first floor was like music. Second floor was used records and DVD sales, VHS sales. And then the third floor was just all rentals. And yeah, it was like heaven to me. So like that was a really, really formative and important place to me before I started working there. And then certainly when I started working there. So yeah, it's a legend. There's a documentary that just came out that was at Sundance called Kim's Video, which doesn't talk so much about a little bit about the history. It talks more about kind of the weird things that happened afterwards when Kim shut down because the collection ended up getting sent to Italy, and it's this whole saga.
Interesting.
But yeah, there's
what's the documentary called?
It's just called Kim's Video. I think it's playing at Tribeca this summer in New York, but yeah, that's a whole other tangent. But I don't know. It was a place where all of the, like, you know, any director that was in New York prepping a movie would have their team come and, like, you know, rent 30 movies off the shelf to, like, when they were prepping something, you know, so you would have like that kind of interaction very directly with the film industry. That's what was so interesting, is that you were really directly kind of connecting with people in that field, I guess, you know. And, you know, like Parker Posey and all these actors and stuff would come in all the time, had active memberships. They would come to research things for films or just because they wanted to watch films. Famous musicians would come in all the time. I mean, I would ring up all sorts of people, like anyone from like Michel Gondry to like Devendra Banhart to like, I mean, it was just like a crazy, like every day, you know. So it really was a very important place, I think, to a lot of people and a lot of filmmakers, and a lot of the people that then worked there went on to become, you know, very well known, you know, musicians and filmmakers and actors. So it was like it was just like this incubator, I guess, for like this like certain type of personality or person, and really fostered the careers of a lot of people, I think. Wow,
that's incredible. Yeah. So when did they close? Do you know when they closed? Like what year, or around what year?
It was like something around, like, I should just know this, but I wasn't working there at the time, so I'm trying to think. My memory feels a little foggy. I feel like it was like around 2010 or 2012, or maybe closer to somewhere 2010. It was sometime around that time period. Yeah, it's probably closer to 2010. But yeah, it closed down for, I think, a variety of different reasons. And also just with like the shifting changes in media and like how people are consuming media. But again, like, I think the really sad part of it was that community aspect, because it's like, it's great to be able to watch a movie in your home whenever you want to, but then you don't get to go and talk to somebody about it afterwards or ask somebody for a recommendation. And I think what's really cool about it is that you're trading in ideas. It's not even so much the film itself. It's like what that film represents and why that's so important to you. And then you find other films that also hit that same like emotional mark for you.
Totally.
So I love that because it opens up larger conversations for people to talk about larger I don't know, just like societal issues or emotional things that, you know, like that you wouldn't necessarily have an easy entree to otherwise.
Of course.
So I really like the community aspect is so important.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's, also what the beauty of within art, or what the beauty of art contains, is to be able to have complex conversations around something. I mean, it could be, you know, any sort of subject, and to have a piece that, and also to have like polarizing opinions on like the film itself. Like someone could be like, oh, I really love that film. And someone else could think, oh, that film was fucking garbage or something, you know? And I always find those conversations to be interesting, because if you're on opposite ends of that sort of spectrum, then, you know, it's like, what does that infer about the person you're having the conversation with, and like, you know, their ideas about life and those sort of things, or what their motivations are for watching a film, or what their perspective is on life in general. And I think, like, you know, to be able to have open dialogues about things, I think that's where you can have a lot of empathy towards people potentially, or it allows like a channel to have empathy. And yeah, I think that's what's beautiful about just art in general is that sort of like community aspect, and that those conversational pieces that can happen around a film, for instance, in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also because I think filmmaking in particular, I mean, I think all art forms do this, but I think filmmaking is, I guess, the most, maybe, I don't know, all-encompassing way in which to experience another person's perspective who may be radically different than you. Yeah. And I think that's what's really interesting, is when you have people that, like, I love it when people think that they have nothing in common with a character and then watch a movie and are really emotionally affected by it, because I think that that's what promotes the sort of greater maybe mission of communicating, which is to kind of break down these sort of imaginary barriers that people think are dividing everybody, that I don't think necessarily always exist, or that I think can be really blown out of proportion, because I do think that people are a lot more connected than we're led to believe. And so I think there's something so great about like turning somebody on to a piece of cinema or a piece of art that can radically change their perspective. It feels like the one way as like artists you can kind of push maybe towards a better future, even if it, I don't know, like I know it's not anything direct. I know I'm not going and like politically changing anything necessarily, or I'm not like going out and like, you know, volunteering or something like that. But I guess like in terms of the types of formats that, you know, you can work in as like an artist, I love the idea that you might have the opportunity to change somebody's mind or make them think about something that they wouldn't necessarily have previously thought about. I think that's a really exciting kind of idea. And not that it always has to be that way. There's so many different forms of art, you know, and maybe it's just an exhilarating entertainment for the night or whatever, but there is a lot of power to it as a format. There's a lot of power to media in general. And it's a magical act, I think, creating cinema. I think like that you're casting a spell over people, and that gives people the opportunity to relax into and experience something different than they would necessarily allow themselves to in real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you said casting a spell, I just imagine you having glitter in your hand and kind of blowing it in someone's face, you know, and then it's like, and now the spell shall be cast upon you, upon thee. Okay, before we go into your film, My Animal, I did want to ask, speaking about this sort of like visceral emotional quality that one can have towards a film, can you remember the first film that you had that sort of emotional connection with?
Man, I feel like that's hard because I feel like there's so many movies that influence me. I mean, I think that there are movies that I saw as a child that really followed me, but like, I don't know. I mean, like, oh man, that's a tough one. I was really obsessed with this movie. I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of like early influences or things that just like stuck in my brain. I saw this movie. I remember renting it at the video store in Topeka, Kansas, and it was like it was like Disney's only horror movie that they made, called The Watcher in the Woods. But
what about Return to Oz?
Oh yeah, Return to Oz. Okay, so those two, Return to Oz and Watcher in the Woods, like those were really those made pretty huge impressions on me as a kid. And we're talking about like really, really early influences, like when I was like 4 or 5 years old. Those were some of the like films that really just like, I was like, oh man. And then looking back on it, and I became obsessed with Watcher in the Woods. And actually Kim's led me to finding out what that movie was, because when I was a kid, I just never remembered the name of it, but it kind of haunted me. And so I remember actually I was talking to one of the clerks there, and I was like describing the movie, and he was like, oh, you mean Watcher in the Woods? And I was like, oh my God. And it was just like, it was like this revelation to me to be able to remember what that movie was, to be able to see it and see the big box like version of it, and I actually I ended up going on eBay and getting that same big box version that I remember being on the shelf when I was a kid, because it was just, I don't know, there was something about that, the object or something that seemed like it held power or something. I don't know. So yeah, that's kind of a random one, but I don't know. I was influenced by so many different things. I kind of just got into a mode of anything I could get my hands on. And it would be everything from like, oh, I'll watch like some sort of experimental Czech animation, and then I'll watch like a 1970s documentary, and then I'll watch, like tons of European and foreign films, or I'll watch like all of Wong Kar-wai, or I'll, I just would go through like obsessive periods. And then that continued into like me working at Kim's, where I'd be like, I'm going to watch every single like Indonesian horror film, in a row. And so I just would get kind of obsessive about certain things, or I would be working on projects that would inspire me to go down like a rabbit hole. So it really shifts and change like influences, depending on where I'm at and what is really intriguing to me. But those are really early ones, I guess. If we're talking about like early references.
Sure. Well, I think, okay, so I have a couple things to say about that. So I think it's really interesting when you have conversations with people, artists sometimes, and they don't want to expose themselves to different art practices or different films, for instance, because they think it might overly influence them. But I think that to be open and to watch like all sorts of different films from different cultures, you don't know how that'll affect your practice, or if like what, because like when I was watching your film, I was like, oh, that's 12 frames a second. And then you said Wong Kar-wai, and I was like, that looks like, a Wong Kar-wai sort of like thing, or, but, I think like we're all, just by the constant energy that's, for instance, like me coming to New York, like I definitely feel a huge energy shift as opposed to being in Brazil or South America or Mexico, and I think like, it's, I think that there's this sort of romantic idea of that, like, Thoreau kind of like going in the cabin in the woods and, writing your novel sort of a thing. But I think that there is a time and place for that sort of isolation, but also that sort of like electric capacity to be in an energy field and to intake that. There's a time and place for that as well. And I think films are a gateway to be able to understand oneself deeper and also to empathize with the world, and also, taking little sprinkles of like a filmmaker and adding it into your own artwork. I think that's really powerful. And but I wanted to say, when you talked about Watcher in the Woods, that's what the film's called?
Yeah.
So like I was thinking about that idea of like, finding that film that, you have little snippets of in your memory from when you were a child. And there's a film that I have never been able to find out what it is about, but I have those pictures in my head from when I was a kid. And I just imagine the catharsis of that feeling of being able to obtain that VHS tape and to know what that film is. But there's like this one lost film that plagues me when I hear something like this. And I'm like, fuck, what the fuck is that film? You know, like, anyways, it's interesting how like these, and essentially what we're talking about is just like snippets of memory, and how those memories contain an emotional quality. And, you know, and that's sort of like the catharsis or the relational qualities of a conversation, and how like art can open that up, I guess.
Yeah. I think like the interesting like thing when you were speaking that I was thinking about was just how I think in a lot of art forms, there's this sense of, you know, artists wanting to be very pure or like stay away from influences. And I think that in film, there's maybe I've always felt that there's just like a different perspective. I think that directors very openly talk about their love for cinema and talk about their love for other directors and talk about how those early influences. And I think that like, I mean, I think the stuff that I watched when I was young is always going to be the stuff that sticks with me the hardest, you know, the stuff that really resonated with me then. But I don't know. I kind of love that there's that conversation, and I don't ever feel like, I don't feel like I should have to like personally that I have to stay away from influences or ideas, because I think that the way that everything gets blended together, it comes out in a completely unique container, at least for me and the way that I experience my own practice. It's like there's 70 different reference points here, and they don't even make any sense together, and they're coming from so many different vantage points, and then that creates something really interesting and unique, along with like just who you are as a person and the things that you can't escape from your own style even if you tried. So I think that like that I find that really interesting. I mean, I think that certainly when I was younger, I was like way more obsessive with watching movies. In some ways, I feel a little nostalgic for that time period because I don't really feel like I have the time for that anymore. And I feel like now, in a way, watching movies feels like it's more work driven, and that I feel like I'm mostly watching something because I'm looking at like an actor I'm interested in. So I feel like this sort of purity that I had maybe when I was younger, where it was just like just watching movies for the sheer love of it, I just feel like I don't have as much time for that anymore because I'm concentrated on making them, which is great. But I do think that I have a different relationship now with watching films. And I think certainly after making one, you have a different relationship with the craft, you know?
Mm-hmm. And I think that can ebb and flow too, you know, depending on where you are along the spectrum of life. And like, it was interesting that you said the 70 ideas, because then that transported my brain into David Lynch's masterclass when he said, you know, pick like 70 ideas, and then that's your film. Which, you know, some of his films definitely feel like that. But
I didn't know that. I haven't seen his masterclass, so that's cool. That 70 was the.
It was no. He said specifically 70 ideas. You put them on flashcards, and anyways, it's just interesting.
That's funny.
And then, but something else that, you know, when you were talking that came up to me is your partner Mitch, he brought up Kenneth Anger. Kenneth Anger. And then I looked up randomly, you know, because I don't know how the brain works, but you know, you contain little tidbits of information, and then you use YouTube to be able to look, research. And I was researching. First of all, I didn't know he's 96 years old and he's still alive. And I was researching, or I was watching an interview, and the interviewer was like, what makes your film so unique? And he was saying something to the effect that, well, there's only one of me, and, you know, so on and so forth. And I think that sometimes we forget that, you know, there is only one of you, and you have your unique experiences, and even if, and you have your own interpretation of like what those experiences mean to you in life. And then so as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about our conversation the other day when you were talking about this Mugler H&M sort of thing, obsession that you have currently, and how like, all these experiences in our lives can shape our perspective, which in turn, if you are an artist, you can apply those perspectives into a medium. And so I guess I was curious, specifically speaking about your film, there was that casino scene, and I was thinking, like, it's a casino scene where all these kids, I guess I'll call them young adults, are taking acid, and I'm thinking, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, and you grew up in Reno, and so I was thinking, like, oh, did this happen in your life, or were you able to draw from those sort of experiences?
Yeah, I think I really connected with so much of the screenplay that Jay wrote, because so much of it felt so familiar and so aligned with experiences that I had when I was growing up, and that sense of deep isolation. And certainly the casino was like one scene that really stuck out to me, like growing up in a casino town, because I just got so much joy in seeing that on the page, because it's really specific. And I think that, you don't really have a lot of places to go, I guess, in a casino town when you're underage. And so you sneak into them anyways, but that's like the main point of focus for that city, And so there was a lot of running around downtown with like some of my like crazy friends and like breaking into places and doing all sorts of stuff. I didn't specifically ever take acid in a casino. And I think actually initially it was a different drug. I'm trying to remember what, like Molly or something, that was in that scene. But then like I was talking to our actors, and I'm a really big proponent of LSD just as like an interesting tool, and a tool creatively and intellectually. And so I'm really interested in that. And it was kind of funny because I was sitting there and we were like in Timmins, and we were talking about that scene with like Amanda and Bobby, the two leads. And we just all were like, oh, it has to be acid. Like we just all kind of had that realization that that's what the drug needed to be. And it made sense to all of us. And it felt right. And again, like if I'm going to show drug use in a film, I want it to be, and in a way that maybe kind of makes it somewhat romantic, I want it to be a drug that I actually think is a good one to use, because there are some that I'm like, no, that's probably not a good drug to be using, but that's a drug that I think that everyone should use, because I think that it can completely radically change your perspective on the world. Yeah.
Wait, so am I hearing this correctly? So in the original screenplay, that casino scene was supposed to be Molly?
I think so. I believe that's what it was. It's been a second since I think that's what it was originally scripted as.
But it was something other than acid.
Yeah, exactly. And then it got changed to acid while we were talking through the scene, because when we got to our shooting location, I was working with my cast then, because it was really difficult to work with my cast in advance of the shoot, because it was just, we were just thick in the middle of the pandemic. And there's a lot of, not only is it you're taking into consideration everybody's like health and safety, but also there are just union rules about certain things. And it was really, that was one of the things that was really like complicated and sad to me, was not to have more rehearsal time. But it was also due to the fact that I had actors from all over North America in the film, people from New York, people from LA, people from all parts of Canada. So it was really hard to get everybody together. And then even when I was trying to even audition people in person, it became complicated. I remember we had to kind of come up with this whole system for when I was auditioning the twins for the film, because with children the rules were even more strict. And I was like, I can't tell if somebody can act if they have a mask on, especially when they're kids. You just can't tell if they're going to be any good or not. And so we had to like get these like big like plastic shields, so I could at least see their face when we were doing the audition. So anyways, it was a difficult kind of process with this film, because of the pandemic elements of it, also while shooting in a really cold location where people are more prone to get sick.
Yeah, I could see that. Like, I had a really good question that it kind of just escaped me.
It's fine.
Wait a second. Where was it? It's in there somewhere. Oh, can I say that's a werewolf film?
Oh, of course. Yeah. You can, give the basics. I mean, the basics are already kind of out there.
Okay. Well, okay. So then this is my question. So then, how would you describe this film?
I feel like I'm always bad with my like elevator pitches, but I guess I feel like to me, at the heart of it, I think it's a love story, and it's about, I think, the kind of love, like your first love, and how sometimes that can replicate patterns within your own family history and your own family's trauma that like you kind of start to repeat maybe in your own life until you kind of figure out how to heal yourself so you're not attracted to things that can be maybe like dangerous or in some way negative. So I think like it's really like that early kind of yearning for connection, and again, like unconsciously sort of like replicating certain sort of situations for yourself.
Totally. Yeah.
And I like that the werewolf aspect of it is kind of being used as a means in which to discuss that on a more like subtle or, I don't know, psychological level. And less, I always sort of refrain from calling it a werewolf movie because I feel like it feels really reductionary, or people have like a very specific idea of what that means when they first hear that.
What I think you definitely flip the genre on its head in a way, but I something that I was thinking about too is just this idea of feeling seen. And there was a specific moment in the film where the father and daughter were next. Was it a Datsun, or what was that car?
Oh, like, it's an old Mercedes. It's like a vintage Mercedes.
By the vintage Mercedes.
Yeah.
And there's this love between them, and I think there's a certain feeling seen in this connection between them because they are one of the same, to say the least. I think that I specifically took these two lines, and the dad said, someday someone is going to come along and accept you for who you are. And then Heather said, I can't just be who I am. And I feel like, that, that's a very relatable feeling, I think, just for anyone, but also like when you're so young and when you're going through that first love and it doesn't work out like you want it to work out, and and potentially your first sexual experience. And I loved how the film talks about the challenges of coming into one's own and sexual identity issues, and the idea of feeling seen, but then it also talks about this mother-daughter dynamic and the complexity behind that, and that's what I really enjoyed about the film in general. And I think that that's really what kind of I've never seen a werewolf movie or any sort of monster-oriented, quote-unquote, movie like that. And I think that's what made it incredibly effective on an emotional level. And some horror movies tend to just be about spectacle and without substance, or aesthetic without substance. And I really appreciated that about this film, is that there's a lot of substance and you don't really see the werewolf aspect that much at all, if even at all. I mean, a little bit, and I thought that was very clever. And in the beginning I was thinking there was definitely little hints of the Lichen book and, those sort of things. But, there's this sort of sadomasochistic sort of like bed and stuff, and I was like, what is this torture chamber about? And then, I thought there's certain like comedic elements in it too that I found really created complexity around the film too, and it made it more human in a sense, or relatable in a sense.
I guess like, I that's what really kind of drew me into the script, was that there was like a really strong dramatic sort of core to the film, and then there were these like, genre elements of it, like, and I just really, again, like really like that spin on the werewolf kind of story, because I remember like when my producer first approached me with the story, he was like, oh, well, it's a werewolf movie. And I remember my knee-jerk response was like, okay, I'm going to read it, but I don't think that one's for me, because I just had such an idea. I think compared to other types of monsters, like I think vampire movies, we've seen so many different variations on what that can mean. And and people totally go with it. They're just like, oh yeah, vampires can be anything from like The Hunger to like Twilight to, like it can go in so many different, it can go in so many different corners and so many different ways, and or like the David Lynch, executive produced film Nausea, or like whatever. Like there's so many different ways in which it's been explored, and people are totally cool with that. But I think on the werewolf side, it just always turns into this like kind of more spectacle driven thing or creature driven thing. And so it was interesting to me to kind of fight against that, or to tease that kind of idea with like, chains on the bed, and you don't really know why. And it seems a little like kind of freaky at first. And then you realize, oh no, actually, if this is a family who has this problem, they do have to chain themselves up on certain nights so that they don't kill each other, So it's.
and I also like the comedic elements too, when it's just like, there's like 500 locks on the door. And you just hear click, 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 click. And it's just like, you're waiting for the, it's just like there's that kind of like pause in the moment, and it's like, god damn, how many fucking locks are on this fucking door? You know what I mean? Like, but it makes sense in the context of like, containing the werewolf in the space, so it doesn't go rampant and kill everyone in the house. Well, also just sort of like functioning as that like metaphor of like how much of yourself you're trying to like keep within, or how much you're just trying to like hide everything inside of you, especially at that age where you just don't feel like you can really truly express yourself, even if you know internally who you might be or the things that you're really drawn to or attracted to. There's so much courage it takes to be able to start accepting that. And I think that comes more with like age and experience, where you get to a point where you're like, I don't care what anyone thinks about me. I don't have time to think about that. Like, I'm just going to be on this planet for a certain period of time, and I need to be truthful to that, as much as I can be. And I think that's something that's really difficult for people. I mean, lifelong, I think that's difficult for people, but especially when you're a teenager, and especially when you're a teenager growing up in the middle of nowhere. And I grew up in a lot of weird places. And so a lot of my childhood was in Topeka, Kansas, and that was real weird. And I think that I felt really isolated there because it was such a heavy, extremist Christian sort of community that myself and my family, we just like did not fit into that at all. And I think like that leads to a greater sense of isolation. Not only are you in this like kind of, you're actually physically sort of like isolated kind of in the center of the country with like nothing really around you but cornfields, but also you're just like isolated for your ideas, And so I think there is that kind of, that can be really tough in that kind of like environment. And I grew up down the street from like the Westboro Baptist Church, and like Fred Phelps, and how he would like go around with like his entire family, including very young children, with just like absolutely horrific, like anti-gay kind of propaganda. And like that was really tough seeing that stuff like growing up, because it was just so hate filled. So I don't know, there was always that implicit sense of like violence in some of those small towns, I think maybe similar, just because this has been mentioned before, like how David Lynch, there's like a violence in the everyday, or there's a violence in the American landscape. And I think that that's
that's often like hidden under the surface. I think now, arguably, it's less hidden under the surface than maybe it used to be. But that sense that like at any moment something really dangerous could happen. I think that's like definitely holds from when I was a child to now. I mean, even now it might be a more overt threat in certain parts of the country, but yeah.
Yeah.
I think I started drifting on that conversation a little bit, you know, the werewolf thing, but then just getting into I guess like a larger conversation about, I don't know, the secrets, maybe this, I don't know, like small
like
places can
politics
have. Yeah. Or just like, I don't know, or just again, like this inherent kind of violence that exists under the surface of American life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's maybe different than maybe other places or something. I mean, I don't know. I think that's probably everywhere, but there's a certain brand of it, I guess, in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's more widely expressed because the United States is such a media hub, you know, that penetrates a lot of different cultures and different countries and is kind of, well, for a long time has been put on a pedestal, you know, so, but I think, you know, something that I found interesting too is the way that you built tension in the film. And so I'm curious, I mean, I don't know how reductive this question is, but I'm going to say it anyways, but I'm curious where you learned that sort of like the building of tension, or if you can reference any films that do that really well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think some things just kind of, in terms of like your practice, so much of it is just like doing things over and over again, understanding the way in which you want to work as an artist. Like, I think my background is like as an editor. I mean, like, I think I really like always kind of prided myself on having a lot of technical knowledge of film because I feel like it just makes you a better creator. Like just in terms of, you know, what things you can like press on and you know what techniques you can use to heighten the emotional space that you need to get to for your audience. So I don't think that you can just be like a purely technical director because it's got to have the emotion and all the other aspects of the craft. But I do, I love knowing the sort of like tricks in editorial and the ways in which you build tension by the decisions you make in the edit room. Like it completely changes the movie. So I think, because I was a co-editor on the film, it's just stuff that it feels, once you just kind of have done it enough times, it just feels like obvious. Like I just kind of know. I'm just there in the suite and I'm like, oh, well, this shot should follow this. And if we do it like this, or if we like slightly, you know, speed ramp here and like speed up the shot here just for like an instant, it will then like give you this other type of feeling, you know? But I think I'm always just chasing the feeling. Like, does that feel right as an edit?
Totally. Yeah.
So I don't know if it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure somewhere in there, it's the result of watching a lot of movies and understanding certain things structurally. But I feel like so much of what I actually am doing when I'm on set, like I almost feel like you prep or you ingest certain reference points like a lot up front just so that you can forget them on set. And then it's sort of with you, but I'm not like consciously ever referencing something when I'm like on set or anything, like when I'm actually doing the creating or when I'm actually like editing. That stuff feels pure intuition.
Totally.
So I would almost do that a lot with like my shot list, where even when I was working on like short films or music videos or whatever, I would write out my shot list in advance and then I'd print it out and fold it and put it in my back pocket. And I would almost never refer to it. But I would always know what to do. I always had that like kind of imprint in my mind of like, I need to make sure I get these things. And then it just like, you just go off pure kind of instinct on that stuff. So it's yeah, I don't know. I'm not like as conscious about it when I'm in the moment, when I'm shooting or when I'm editing, I guess.
No, it makes sense. Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. I mean, I think you can extrapolate that among all different sorts of mediums, you know, for instance, like, well, A book that comes to mind is The Inner Game of Tennis by Timothy Galway.
I have not read that.
It's really good, and I think it people really like it because it applies to so many different types of mediums. Specifically it's talking about tennis in there, but for the sake of this conversation, I think you build a repertoire of techniques that become second nature over time, right? So like maybe at first the techniques, like you can be so focused on like technical aspects or, and I think in photography terms, even in cinematography terms, but I think there's a lot of people that are very gear focused and like, and very like focus on just like different cameras, different lenses and things like that. And I think it's good to an extent, but really, I mean, I don't know, something that just kind of comes to mind is like Harmony Korine's film Trash Humpers. They just filmed on VHS, and like VHS is such a primitive form now that you would look at something like that, it's like it's almost a disregard of like technical abilities or aspects, right? But I think like the thing that makes Harmony Korine's films him is that, well, he's so embedded in his own process, and it's very much like, whether he's doing like commercial or whatever, they're very much him, And so I guess this goes back to like the Kenneth Anger thing, is like understanding that there is only one of you and having faith in that. And also I think in film, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to be able to trust your own instincts, whether that's, preparing for a film and finding the right people, and maybe you might not have like the best case scenario at all times, but I think it makes things a lot, makes things a lot more enjoyable if you're surrounded by the right people. But I think like, where am I going with this? I think what I'm coming to the conclusion of is just a holistic process with everything in life, whether that's like the film that you work on, you have the right people for it, or whether that's like, like the people you surround yourself with and how that makes you feel, but just constantly trying to follow those instincts. Not that the instincts will always serve you every single time, but it's something that it's like a muscle that you constantly develop, and you either listen to the instinct or you like shy away from it. And like going back into your film, like, I think that's a challenging thing when you're younger too, is like you have these things that are very much you, like whether it's sexual identity or something like that. And, it's like in those challenging situations, you either shy away from it or do you like listen more to like who you actually are, right? And that's where I believe like the holistic sort of process is outside of socially conditioned responses. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that the only times I've failed is when I haven't trusted my own instincts. I think that's really important. And I agree that it is a muscle and you have to kind of exercise it. The more that you trust it, the more that you exercise that kind of judgment based around how you're feeling. Obviously, in tandem with like knowledge or experience or whatever, you have all those factors that kind of come together that become like your like instinct or whatever. And I think the more you exercise that, the more you feel emboldened to exercise it. And so it just becomes this great self-fulfilling thing where you're like, I'm going to trust it. And then you continue to trust it. And then you make choices that are more authentically in line with yourself, whether that's like just you personally, if that's you in your craft or art form, in your relationships. I think the more that you listen to that, the happier you're going to be as a creator and as a human being on the planet. And I think, so I'm always like trying to I think that's where I got the most frustrated on this project, when there are forces or circumstances that were pushing me away from those things. Or I like to do a lot of things that are not necessarily like, I don't know, like they're kind of like off the outside of the bounds of what people understand is like this certain set of rules you're supposed to follow on like a film set. Or I often find the most like liberating moments were when I was just there alone with my DP, like kind of not having the pressures of like the set environment and being able to just be really free. Like that's stuff that feels really liberating to me. And I think to your point with like the technical stuff, I mean, I think on my end, I've always just been like, I remember once there was some sort of photographer, I can't remember who this is accredited to, but somebody was asking this photographer, what's your favorite camera? And the photographer responded, anyone you give me. And I loved that so much because it was just such confidence in like, it will shine through no matter what gear I have. It doesn't fucking matter what gear, because that's not the most important thing. Yeah. I love like knowing the technical element because it's like, because then you can do so much with so little. So many of my projects, people would probably be shocked, or when I talk to people that are like more gear interested or whatever, which is fine. That's a cool thing too. But like when I tell them like what stuff I'm using, they kind of just like look at me as if like, how did you get that out of that technology? And like, to me, it's like that technology is interesting and you can use it to certain ends, but it's not going to be the thing that makes your film or project good. Like that doesn't really matter. It's really just like, what are you trying to say, or who's the person behind that? And then you can use good gear or you can use bad gear. You can use certain things for different effects.
Yeah.
But it's really just about like, can you get people to that same emotional space, regardless of what you're using as like a tool.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, I love this idea of like, know the rules so you can break them, you know?
Too. Yeah. I like
and
that.
so like, I love knowing like the skill sets of like, or like, I'm just so used to working on stuff that's so low budget that I'm always trying to find workarounds to make things seem like they had a lot more money than they did. Mm-hmm. Or figuring out like, okay, we didn't have a lot of time to shoot this scene. So how do I like figure that out in like the edit? Okay, like we didn't have time to get this shot I really wanted, so I'm going to take this other moment and flip it in reverse, and you just see it for a second and you can't tell that it wasn't what we needed to be because we forgot to shoot this actor sitting down in their chair, but turns out we really needed it in the edit. And you figure out weird workarounds to make it happen. So I think like, and that really I think comes from that like gritty underground or independent style of filmmaking, where you just don't have the luxury to be on set for a long time and you just have to work through it come hell or high water. So I think that informs a lot of how I approach things. And I really believe that there are ways to do things that don't have to cost a lot of money. And I think there's a mythology around that in film in particular.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think that really shines through in some of your music videos. Like I was watching the Zola Jesus Exhume video, and the way that was cut, I was like, wow, this is super, super interesting. And sometimes when you see videos with a lot of effects in it, it's like the effect becomes tired, depending on like who's doing it, right? But then I was like finding myself intrigued by it because you really understood the tension that needed to be continued throughout the piece. And I also found that in like some of your other work with Nika, who's a mutual friend of ours, but and like I know music videos just in general never have enough money in the budget, in general, right? And so like, and I was looking to see, like, I was like, who edited this? I was like, oh, okay, so you edit your own stuff. So, which makes sense because it has a very like signature feeling, and I think that especially for a filmmaker to also be an editor, I think it's super important, whether that is to be able to relay that to other people, but just understanding like how all those techniques amount to the final product, you know? But, gosh, what was I going to say? Well, so from this project, like, what do you think that you learned on this project that will inform you on your next feature film?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of really brutal lessons on My Animal. It was a pretty intense production, and I think I was sort of thrown everything that, I mean, okay. I feel not everything. I'm sure that there are much worse things that could then compound or happen, but there was a lot of really intense things that happened on the shoot, and I think it was difficult for a lot of reasons. But I think that you have to kind of come to see that stuff as teachers or as things that you need to learn or things that you need to understand, or in some ways helps to protect you for the future in terms of what you need to look out for. And so I sort of have to just take those experiences and then apply them towards everything in the future of what I think is like acceptable or not on a production. So I think like it's good. It makes me, I think like that project has made me a much stronger director, because of all of the things that happened and the having to problem solve with such extreme circumstances, like being on a low budget movie and having a COVID shutdown for 2 weeks and watching a quarter of your budget go down the drain is pretty stressful. And having to know how to like deal with that, rebound, and get your shoot back on the ground under that kind of tremendous pressure financially. I think that like that taught me a lot. I think a lot of like considering just like where people I think were at on like a crew level emotionally coming out of a pandemic and how fragile the ecosystem was interesting to kind of see and to understand just from a human psychological perspective, and understanding, you know, I think that there's like this sort of thing that artists kind of get into where when you're really trying to get that first big project off the ground, and especially when there's financing levels of financing involved that are can be very preventative. And I think certainly in film, that's a bigger roadblock than maybe other mediums. I think that like you can get into this situation of like, I don't know, like having to accept circumstances that maybe, you know, instinctually are not great, but you kind of don't have any other option. Like, it's just like, okay, you either jump into the deep end and figure out how to swim or you don't. And so I knew with this situation, I was being thrown into, okay, like this is not ideal. Nothing about this project is ideal, but do you want to make your first movie? And my answer was, yes, I want to make my first movie. But I think then after going through that experience, you kind of, your mentality and entire worldview can then shift, because you get out of the sense of, I have to just accept whatever is being given to me, and then to have the confidence of when to say no to things that aren't the right circumstances. So I think that that's something, having that level of confidence and knowing I can say no to this set of circumstances. And then it's like me selectively choosing with the universe. I'm saying no to that path. And then another door is going to inevitably open that's like, oh, well, you didn't like that. So here's another thing that you can choose from. And this is going to be different. And do you like that? And it's sort of like, it's very interesting how that kind of happens. I think there's a lot of fear sometimes with artists of like saying no to things, or like, oh, especially when you're freelance, is the next thing going to come? Or is it bad if I say no to this thing? But I think as you gain confidence, or as you go through things that you really don't like, then you're like, oh no, I definitely don't want to go down that path. And I'm completely comfortable closing that door. And I think when that happens, necessarily something different opens up. So I actually think that's really interesting to see. And again, I'm at an advantage now because I've made the first film, and that's usually the hardest leap that you have to make, going from short form to long form as a filmmaker specifically. And there's going to be new and different challenges. I don't think it will ever that will ever change, but I do think that what's changed is my own relationship to my work and understanding that I have needs, and those needs are incredibly important to the ecosystem and health of the entire shoot. And I have to listen to those things and not throw those things under the bus, you know? And I think is like a lot of artists maybe can relate to this. Like you kind of put yourself through like hell trying to get yourself built up in your career. Whether it be like a musician who has to tour and crash on people's floors, you know, or you're, I don't know, like any kind of artist I think goes through that. Right. And I guess the idea becoming as you establish yourself more and more, as you get more and more experience, you can start to close the door on certain things that, you know, are maybe inherently negative or not actually good for the process. So I think that's like the biggest learning experience that I can kind of take from my animal, is just sort of looking at what I want and what I don't want and being really decisive about that. But I think that that's like an evolutionary process that happens with anything in your life, even if it's like relationships or whatever. You have like a really bad breakup and then you're like, oh, I don't want to do that again, you know, or, oh, I like let that person treat me really badly. Like that's not cool, you know? And then you slowly start to like, in all these different areas of your life, you start to shift and change as you have these experiences. And honestly, some of the most negative ones can bring the biggest changes forth in your life, because it's forcing you to confront certain things that you've been like avoiding or not like meeting head on. So I always kind of feel like the stuff that makes you uncomfortable is the stuff that you have to go right towards. You just have to go and you have to meet it, and you have to be like, oh, why am I uncomfortable with this thing? Or why is this thing stressful to me? And as you start to directly confront it, it starts to lose its power or its grip over you, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's like a really interesting part of the process, you know? So yeah, I don't know. It's such a hard balance, right? Like that balance of wanting to remain, like having a lot of faith in people, because I think that I do, but also being aware of the negative directions things can take as well. It's like finding that balance of not becoming jaded in your field, but also, and keeping that open channel and that emotional channel that you need, while also not putting yourself or your team into bad circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's a very complex balance.
Mm-hmm. I think you definitely eloquently put all those ideas together in a very nice, concise advice column. No, I mean, I say that, you know, like in jest, but also like I feel like that's like things that people need to know, you know, and so I wanted to ask, this is more of like a personal thing of interest, but so you interview people too, is that right?
Yeah, in the past. Yeah, I mean, I interview people I have a documentary project, so I've done a lot of interviewing with that, and that in particular has been really interesting, because sometimes you're talking to people who really don't, maybe like who have a lot of reservations about talking about something. I've also just interviewed a lot of like creatives, actors, directors, writers, because I've done a lot of interviews for about the filmmaking process for different distribution companies. So like for a little while, I was like doing stuff that would be like incorporated into like a Blu-ray, right, of like a movie, you know, and you talk to those different creatives. And I found it a really, I don't do that so much anymore, but I found it a really interesting thing to do, because you learn so much just by hearing about other people's experiences, and it really reconfirms questions maybe that you have, or helps you to understand questions that you're confronting in your own profession. So I thought specifically talking to people about their work in the film industry was actually really like great experience for a little while. So yeah, I think like I do enjoy talking to people about their lives and experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Yeah. I that's that. And it's a very different skill set too. I think, working as like a director on a narrative and also a documentary, it's very different kinds of skill sets. And there's something that's so personal, I guess, about the personal interview with somebody and knowing how to like be there for somebody when they're talking about things that are really personal and like holding that space, you know, like that interview kind of space for somebody. Like I remember when I think it's different, the stuff like working, like talking to other artists and stuff, and then talking to people about their own personal lived experiences. I remember one of the things when I've been working on this kind of longer term documentary project, it would feel really draining at the end of the day if I did like when we were traveling and stuff, and maybe we'd do like 2 or 3 interviews in a day, it would just like completely knock me out because you realize how much you had to be present emotionally for people. And it was like I guess like you have that too in like narrative filmmaking, but it's different when it's something so personal to somebody. So I think like that was something that caught me off guard. I was like, there really is like kind of such a skill set to this. And also like, I think it kind of made me a lot more adventurous with people in a way, because I had people like slam the door on me. You know what I mean? I had people that just like would be very aggressive towards me or like not want to talk about certain aspects of their lives, and having just like that confidence of being like, okay, cool. You were like, just like maybe like very impacted by this question, or you like, I don't know, like I found it a really interesting psychological space to start out with somebody who's like really closed off and to figure out how to get somewhere with them that was like real. And like that to me was like so interesting, just from like a getting to an emotional space with somebody who's not used to getting to that kind of emotional space with themselves or anybody else, at least not people that they don't know. Yeah. So I find it a really like intriguing way to connect with people. And a lot of times people will like reveal stuff that they haven't even told like their own family members or something, you know, like just weird stuff will come up. Like a question will prompt something that somebody will talk about, something, an experience that they haven't really brought up before or whatever. So there is that kind of interesting element of being a stranger and walking into somebody's life and being able to get maybe richer information if you're willing to take the time and help someone feel comfortable and supported in that process, you know? And then you realize maybe how lacking that is for a lot of people, like just that having that very like genuine support, or just like total lack of judgment. Just like, I'm going to let you talk to me about your experience because I have no place in making any kind of judgment on that because I didn't live your life. And like, I think sometimes there's a little bit too much of that in the culture right now where there's a lot of judgment.
Yeah, I feel that way too.
And it's really tough because it's like, how do you get anywhere with anybody if you're just going to judge them the second that they say anything? They're not going to talk to you about anything. Why would anyone do that? Regardless of what it's about, no one's going to open up unless you can just come at it just from like a purely curious and empathetic place. Like, why do you feel that way? Mm-hmm. Why is it that you feel that you have to align with that certain sort of ideology? Like, what was it that made you connect with that? When you have those really open, non-judgmental conversations, I feel like so much can be revealed. And it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier in this idea that just like we're so much more connected than we're led to believe. Mm-hmm. And if you're just willing to go there with people and reserve judgment, there's so much like, I don't know, there's so many parallel lines that you can actually find with people that you think that you have nothing in common with. Yeah. So, you know.
No, I totally agree. And I think like, you know, I would like to challenge people that are listening to this to really take the time to have patience and to listen to people. And whether that is like a close family member or someone they just meet on the street, or, you know, I think like being able to listen to other people and their opinions without judgment and with an open heart can really go a long way. And you won't know exactly how you can influence that person maybe not immediately, but I think like those sort of affirmations over time of like open-hearted people can really affect the culture as a whole, as opposed to just, you know, placing a judgment on someone. And I don't think that people are necessarily like all good and all bad. You know, it's on a scale. So yeah.
No, I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
I love like inviting the audience who's listening now to think about that and to practice that, because I think that we would have significantly less problems in the world if people actually just took the time to listen to one another and hear each other out without getting so emotionally provoked. You know, I think sometimes it's like you have to kind of step outside of your own worldview and perspective to understand somebody else's, you know? And yeah, I think it's really damaging. I mean, of course, anyone's going to be immediately defensive the second they tell you something. You're like, oh, well, you're wrong. And, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. And you shouldn't be thinking that. Like, I mean, that's like almost kind of like thought police or something, you know? It's like people can think and feel however they want to. You know, the actions they take are maybe a different thing.
Yeah.
But I think that if you just, I don't know, like, I guess just as like part of my explorations as an artist and like understanding experiences, understanding the human condition, you have to be willing to go to those places. And like, I love the idea of just like going to the middle of nowhere, sitting down at a bar next to somebody who doesn't seem at all like you and just talking to them, just have a conversation and see what happens as a result. It's like an interesting kind of human experiment in a way. And I don't know. I think there's a way to always kind of, you know, connect with people, again, who seem really different than you. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's always something there that you can connect on. And yeah, and again, like ultimately that's what draws me to filmmaking is just connection. You know?
Yeah.
So it's all part of the same.
Yeah.
It's all part of the same like kind of impulse, you know, is that connection. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean, I can definitely see it in your film. And I think like that's kind of what I'm talking about is that holistic sort of process, like how, you know, being a director like you have the opportunity to be able to take your experiences and put it into the film and maybe not like directly, but maybe the emotions that are behind it and yeah.
No, I mean, no, I know what you're saying. I mean, I think like, I always think about it, like with My Animal, I kind of think about how it's a film that I feel like I would have appreciated when I was younger, when I needed that kind of, those kinds of stories. I think that would make me like most excited is this idea of these like, you know, kind of isolated teenagers watching this movie in the middle of nowhere or whatever. Like, I think that's actually the most gratifying kind of audience to reach because those are the people that maybe need it the most, you know? Like, it's cool to have people in like coastal cities going to see it at like hip movie theaters or whatever. But like, I think that like when I really think back on it, it's like, okay, well, this is a film that I'm making for a younger version of myself who needed this at that time period, you know?
Yeah, I like
so
that.
It's all part of this like circular kind of story, you know? Like, it's like, I want to give back like all the filmmakers who gave to me when I was young, you know? And
yeah.
So yeah, if I can kind of like reach out and connect with those people and be like, it's going to be okay. And you're going to be okay. Like, I think like that's really like maybe the most meaningful specifically for this project, because I think that it's very much about that feeling when you're in high school, right? Like it's very much encapsulating that kind of emotional space and how, just how messy it can be, you know? It's just a really messy time period.
Yeah. Especially when you're a werewolf.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, the werewolf part. I guess the other thing, like in terms of talking about what the movie is and what it embodies, I just love the idea of transformation and inner transformation. And once you accept that inner transformation, then you can start to transform the world around you once you accept it within yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's beautiful. I think that's a great place to cap it. And
perfect.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, of course. This is really fun. It's actually just nice to be able to sit and talk about ideas and, I don't know, approaches to techniques and things like that. So it's fun. I don't get to do it that much, so it's nice.
Yeah. No, I had a good time as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. And we're just sitting in front of each other, and it's like just finding a fun. Yeah, bye. Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. YouTube and creative support is by Tyler Scully. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you next time.